Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's ICD webinar, Navigating U.S. Policy Shifts, Implications for Canadian Boards, Executive Compensation, and CEO Performance Management. My name is Bridget McKellar. I'm a partner with Hugessen Consulting based in Toronto. I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleague Scott Munn, who is a partner based in Calgary. Before we begin, on behalf of the ICD and Hugessen, we want to honor and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land, and that today our attendees are located all over Canada and on other Indigenous lands with applicable treaties or unceded territories. Today's webinar will run for 1 hour and includes a Q&A segment at the end. Let's begin and introduce our panelists. Susan Jones is an experienced corporate director and former C-suite executive with over 25 years of experience in the agricultural, mining, energy, and transportation sectors. She's recognized for her leadership in ESG, capital allocation, risk mitigation, and transformational change. She spent 15 years at Nutrien, where she held senior roles across potash, phosphate, European operations, sales, marketing, and distribution. As Chief Legal Officer, she played a key role in the $36 billion merger of Agrium and Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan to form Nutrien in 2018. Susan currently serves on the boards of CN Rail and TC Energy. Her previous board roles include Piedmont Lithium, ARC Resources, Seven Generations Energy, Gibson Energy, and Canpotex. She chaired the special committee of the TC Energy board during its 2024 South Bow spinoff. Susan holds a BA in Political Science and Hispanic Studies from the University of Victoria, an LLB from the University of Ottawa, a leadership diploma from the University of Oxford, and a director's certificate from Harvard University. Dr. Indira Samarasekera is a corporate director serving on the boards of Magna International and Intact Financial, bringing extensive experience in governance, strategy, and innovation. Indira previously served on the boards of Bank of Nova Scotia, TC Energy, and Stelco. From 2005 to 2015, she served as president and vice chancellor of the University of Alberta. An internationally recognized metallurgical engineer, Indira was appointed an officer of the Order of Canada for her work in steel process engineering. She holds a PhD in metallurgical engineering from the University of British Columbia and has advised on public policy and governance through roles with the Science, Technology, and Innovation Council and the TMX Group and Institute of Corporate Directors Committee on the Future of Corporate Governance in Canada. Welcome, Susan and Indira.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As mentioned, Scott and I are partners at Hugessen Consulting. Hugessen advises boards on executive compensation, performance measurement, related governance, as well as board effectiveness. We work with a range of public, private, and crown corporations across Canada and the US. We're very pleased to be actively involved with the ICD nationally, including delivering on the Director Education Program across Canada. We want to thank the ICD for the help in organizing today's event. And so with that introduction, let's take a look at today's agenda. Over the next hour, we'll explore the ways in which Canadian boards and executive teams are being impacted by the rapidly evolving policy landscape, particularly in light of US developments, but this goes broader and we're going to look at a global context as well. We'll begin by setting the stage with a look at the major geopolitical and economic shifts underway. This includes not only US trade policy and tariffs, but also the broader disruptions to global norms and Canada's strategic response, all of which are reshaping board-level thinking around risks and opportunities. From there, we'll examine how these shifts are playing out in business planning decisions. We'll discuss how companies are rethinking capital allocation, supply chains, and earnings guidance in the face of ongoing uncertainty. Next, we'll turn to talent and leadership. We'll discuss how boards are revisiting the profiles of CEOs and executive teams, and how board composition itself may be evolving to meet the demands of this more complex and volatile environment. Then we'll dive into incentive design, looking at how boards are adapting compensation frameworks to maintain alignment with performance, especially when the business outlook is murky and agility is paramount. And with that, I'll pass the mic to Scott to get us started on our content for today.
Thanks, Bridget. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Bridget, as you outlined, let's start with the impact of shifting global policies. So we're in the midst of a dramatic recalibration of global orders, from rising protectionism to the erosion of democratic norms and markets that we, for a long time, considered to be stable. Just last month, the WTO flagged increasing fragmentation in trade relationships, something Canadian companies are grappling with directly. Over the last week, we've seen a focus on EU tariffs and a change in the timeline from implementation. So it's hard to keep track of all of these changes. At the board level, this is more than just a policy issue. It's a risk management and strategic planning imperative. So as you mentioned, as we'll do in each section, we'll start with a poll. So let's pull up the first poll, and then we can turn it over to the panelists for questions. The first poll is, which policy and geopolitical factors are having the most significant impact on your board strategic discussions? For our participants, please feel free to rank them in order, please. Susan, if it's okay with you, we'll start with you. As an experienced director, how are you thinking about the rapid changes we're seeing in the global trade and economic relations?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And maybe, I'll answer the poll as well. And the boards I'm on, it's really being driven by US trade policies, tariffs, and the aftermath of that. And, one thing I'd add to what's already been discussed is the stopping and starting of, even pre-Liberation Day in Canada with the tariffs on Canada and Mexico at 25%, and then Liberation Day, but then the constant pausing of tariffs for further negotiations is causing a lot of havoc to companies and supply chains. And the way I'm thinking about it is really three ways. One is this is really a time where being nimble, resilient, and able to adapt to change is critical, both for boards and management teams. And as boards, to recognize that management is dealing with the speed of change at an even faster rate than we are as board members. And so being able to support them, get on calls, scenario plan, being able to really on the fly address what issues they or their customers or suppliers are dealing with. So that's the first. The second is, we obviously have to be able to manage the risks associated with higher tariffs, inability to sell, our customer issues, our supplier issues. But as importantly, we need to be thinking about opportunities in light of the instability. So are there new markets? Is there market consolidation? Is there a chance to disrupt, or can we be disrupted? So along with this instability comes a lot of opportunity as well. It's just sometimes hard to think about that when you feel like, you're under fire. And then finally, I think it's becoming more and more important to have eyes and ears on the grounds in the markets that we operate to ensure we influence policy and the regulatory environment. Because again, back to opportunity, there is an opportunity to really influence changes that will set our future as Canadian companies on a much better trajectory.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot over to Indira for a second, just to bring her into the conversation and see where this goes. So we're also seeing a shift in some of the long-held global norms. So important yet taken for granted items such as the state of democracy and the rule of law in the US. So how should directors be thinking about their organization's risk frameworks in this context?
So thank you for inviting me to participate, both Hugessen and ICD. So the threat of democracy, really, we are looking at it in terms of what's the consequences for financial markets, right? Not an abstract concept of democracy, but financial markets. And that then leads to what, as a board member or members of boards, how do you think about the risk associated with long-term investment in the United States for a Canadian company or even a multinational? You've pointed out, norms and rules which undermine the US model of democracy and therefore put its global market status as a place of stability and secure returns is now at risk, right? That stability, that secure return, place of secure returns is at risk. And as you pointed out, there are real concerns about the integrity of the legal system and the stability of the US dollar as reserve currency. And it appears that the US administration is prepared to tolerate this economic disruption in pursuit of its goals. So, what do you do in terms of this climate? So I think, as Susan pointed out, this is the time to continue to look at diversification of your markets. A company that's already doing business in China, for example, will have to assess the risks of expanding in China and Asia in general. And let me just, pick up the auto sector, given that I'm on the board of Magna. There are more cars produced in China than either in Europe or the United States. You cannot ignore the Chinese markets, but there are risks that the US will retaliate through restrictions in trade deals, such as it has done by calling China out in a UK trade deal. Now, this has upset China no end. And so you're now going to be caught in the crosshairs of this US China rivalry. And so your ability to expand in China has to be done in the full light of all of this. So for Canada, I think if we just step back as a country, I think we're going to take a page out of Australia's book. I really like the way they've operated, right? They recognize their middle power status. They recognize that they have resources. And so we should leverage our strengths in energy, critical minerals, and our proximity to the Arctic. And we should, as a country, advocate for free trade agreements with other countries in recognition of this rivalry. And companies should take an active role in ensuring that these free trade agreements serve their purpose in accessing markets. Australia has taken resilience over values approach, and they've built out their LNG sector. And, Susan and I both have, obviously been on the board of TC. She's still there. That Coastal GasLink pipeline, right? It was incredibly difficult to build. And yet just look at what it's allowed Canada to do today, right? As of June or July or whenever, LNG Canada is going to ship its first shipment of LNG. So this is an example of a company like TC positioning itself for this long-term opportunity. And I talked about the advocacy on trade policy. Let me touch on two more risks, because we're talking about risk mitigation. One is the corruption risk. As you know, the United States has anti-corruption safeguards like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. And recently, the president has issued an executive order not to repeal the law. Of course, he can't do that, but basically asking a pause on investigations around bribery and corruption. This poses a risk, right? And so Canadian companies doing business have to look at this changing landscape and ensure that they maintain their vigilance over corruption and bribery. So that's one. The other one is to look at prioritizing cybersecurity and operational resilience. Why do I say this? I think that given the cuts that's proposed by the US administration to agencies like CISA and TSA, the US is going to be increasingly vulnerable to foreign cyber attacks. So Canadian company, whether it's TC Energy or Magna or any other big company or even Canadian banks operating in the US should really heighten their threat detection, ensure that their critical infrastructure is secure, and collaborate with industry alliances for shared intelligence. So let me just close by just making one point. I think directors must treat democratic backsliding not as a distant political issue, but as a systemic risk that requires cross-functional adaptation. And we have to integrate, and Susan made this point very articulately about being agile, flexible, but to add to that, I would say integrating geopolitical foresight, ethical leadership, as we sort of navigate this norm-shifting era and build long-term resilience and stakeholder trust.
Thanks, Indira. Let's bring up the poll results, and as that's coming up, it's just amazing to hear both of you talk about the degree of implications coming from all of these policy shifts and how it really just permeates the discussion around the boardroom. So looking at the polling results, which ones were most important? It looks like the shift in US trade policies and tariffs, if I'm reading it correctly. The second largest would be the global political tensions and then the regional political shifts. So all of this will be available, by the way, when the results of the webinar are published in a couple of weeks, but we wanted to quickly go over this material. Let's move on to the business planning implications. And Bridget, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more organization specific. We spoke at the macro level, but when we think about business planning, it strikes us that across all sectors, the actual planning of your business and your how to implement your strategy is far less linear than it was perhaps in the past. You know, we see the ripple effects of tariffs and geopolitical tensions as we spoke about. It's making longer term capital planning more of a moving target. So as boards and management teams are guiding their companies through this volatile environment, it would feel as though the rules are changing very rapidly, you know, mid-game. Um, we'll come to some questions on for Susan and Indira on this topic, but would also like to hear from the audience. So we'll pull up our next poll about, you know, how business planning within your organizations is changing in response to this environment. And while we wait for those results to come in, Susan, I'll go to you first. So in your experience, how is the current environment changing or influencing decision making in the boardroom around business plans?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. So, I guess I just start with the basics, the discussion around, how are we going to meet our business plan? If you're in a publicly traded company, you're out there with guidance. How do we pivot? How resilient are we? But it's not just ourselves. And maybe I'll give you an example through the lens of CN Rail. I mean, CN is moving products from businesses and industries across the country. So whether it's, petrochemicals, petroleum and chemicals, frac sand, lumber, fertilizer, grain, you name it, automobiles, you name it, we're moving goods. And so the question is, what are their business plans? How resilient are they? How are they adapting? How are they diversifying? And so not only are we having our own discussions, but also how resilient is the entire supply chain from our own suppliers through to customers. And that also includes, by the way, trucks, vessels, how everything is being moved. So, scenario planning is becoming more and more critical, I would say. How are we all going to be able to pivot? How are we working together? How are we communicating together? And how diversified are we? And this whole kind of collaborative effort around our partners, customers, and suppliers is really, really important. Also, where are we spending our capital? So, what is our near-term plan? What is long-term? If you think about aluminum and steel tariffs, how is that impacting, our capital that we've set aside for growth in the future? And we know we all need to. We've got the pressure. We need to grow. But what's the impact of that? And then, in the midst of all of this, we need to make sure we're not losing focus on the basics, on our human capital, on the, finances, what we're doing with dividends, share buybacks, et cetera. What are we doing with maintenance capital? How do we position growth capital? What about digital transformation and AI? So, I mean, all of it to say that it's extremely complicated and requires a lot of ability. And I think that's why it started with being nimble, being resilient, and adapting to change, because it's not just ourselves within the boardroom, but it's also, our suppliers, customers, and partners. And then how do we communicate all of that to employees to actually get done what we need to get done? So all of that to say it's complicated.
Complicated, and it's industry wide, or sorry, economy wide. These impacts are being felt, and having to, boards are having to grapple with these challenges. Indira, you have some very interesting experience sitting on the board of Magna and having recently been on the board of Stelco, both organizations in highly capital intensive sectors that we expect will be significantly impacted by the US tariffs. How has this changed business planning at those organizations?
Well, I think to start out, I just have to say it's about how do you deal with uncertainty, right? And the uncertainty genius, doesn't matter what the US administration does, that uncertainty genius is not going back in the bottle, right? So if someone thinks just because we reach a free trade agreement, we can now plan for capital, when capital intensive industries can plan, I mean, I think that's going to be very, very challenging. So let me just talk a little bit about the automotive sector, because Magna is a part supplier. So we have to look at what's happening with our customers. And the biggest challenge has been guidance. What guidance are you going to give the market? I mean, we spent an enormous amount of time in our last board meeting just trying to decide what that guidance should look like. If GM, our largest customer, issues guidance, do we keep whole guidance? Do we give guidance? So this is going to be an area that I think is going to be critical. So GM, for instance, lowered its 2025 financial guidance to include a $4 to $5 billion impact on adjusted earnings. I mean, this is big numbers. And so the consequences, there's no good news here, right? For anyone. But if you take the Canadian auto sector, there are 230 auto parts companies. If there's any glimmer of good news, is that we will no longer be subjected to the 25% tariffs as long as they are CUSMA compliant, which is the US, the free trade agreement, which of course has to be renegotiated. So, back to uncertainty, but at least in the interim. So one of the things that I think is important for companies to do to then assess the impact, right? So Magna, for example, in its quarterly earnings release said that in our estimate, the tariffs are going to cost us $250 million a year. I think that gave some degree of certainty in an uncertain market. We've also said we are going to look at all of our products and determine which are CUSMA compliant, how to get more of them to be CUSMA compliant, and so on. And then, also engaging, I think, in lobbying extensively, political engagement, auto alliances, leading to trying to get concessions from the White House around delayed implementation for some of these things, or outright exemptions. What are the other things we are monitoring? We're monitoring volumes. The auto sector is very sensitive to the number of cars sold in North America, for example, or globally. So we're looking at volumes and trying to assess whether the economic uncertainty and the potential slow growth is going to affect automobile purchases, because that would be a big hit, I think, to all of us. And as I said, we will be not allocating new significant capital until there's some clarity around what this is going to look like. Let me finally say, I think generally speaking, companies like Magna, big capital budgets, big R&D budgets, big opportunities to cut costs, are doing everything like, ensuring we have access to liquidity, looking at our capital expenditures and doing cost cutting. And AI, let me tell you, I think, I've always been one of the people who's slightly skeptical about AI, is this hype or is this hope? But, we had a board presentation, for example, and I think this is critical for all boards to do, of an expert, a Harvard Business School expert on the impact of AI on businesses. And let me tell you, it was an eye opener, even as someone who follows AI. What is clear is that there are some huge opportunities, and the speed with which these opportunities are coming because of the cost coming down is very significant. So I think the opportunity is to, as this period of uncertainty carries on, not to stop all investments, but look at how AI, generative AI, machine learning algorithms can really help companies build more efficient operations, more productive workforces, and have better and more focused targets for growth. So those are some of the sort of ideas around a big capital intensive industry like auto.
That's great, Indira. Thank you for sharing. Let's take a look at what the audience said in terms of your experience, the audience's experience. So if we look at the results here, we see organizations are conducting, and this was multiple choice, so we select all that apply. So conducting vulnerability assessments was the leading contender here. Capital allocation, unsurprisingly, taking a closer look at those strategies and maybe making adjustments, as well as thinking about geographic footprint and diversification. I see, a significant portion, a quarter of respondents just full on pausing major capital investments. And I think that aligns, Indira, with some of your comments around not making any big bets right now in the face of such significant uncertainty. So I think that the conversation, Indira, or the point you make about the AI presentation at the board, or what kind of information are what kind of experts are boards relying upon in additional information, I think leads us a little bit into our next topic around talent and leadership and what's needed at the board level. Either do you hire or buy it? So I will turn that back over to Scott to have that engage in that conversation.
Thanks, Bridget. So we've talked a little bit about global policies and their shifts, and we talked about the impact on business planning. And those are great backdrops in a very big picture. So let's now turn towards the implications for board composition, executive talent management, and executive compensation. So to kick off this segment let's start with board composition. So we're in an environment where candidly, the noise can overwhelm the signal and leadership is being redefined. For many organizations, this has implications for how you think about your board composition and your executive success profile. So Indira, why don't we start with you? In your experience and touching on the AI comment you made, how are boards evaluating their own composition and skill sets in light of these policy shifts? Any capabilities or experiences that are becoming more important?
So let me, what we're really witnessing is huge disruption in geopolitical issues. So I think on the top of my list, and I can briefly mention what I think about AI in a minute, but let me start with geopolitical savvy. This is not something you can easily get, other than having a very experienced board member who understands the world, the political, the regulatory, economic risks that would directly threaten the business operation and strategy. So let me talk about sort of what might be those key capabilities that you would want to be looking for. So regional expertise. So for example, if you're going to do business in China, you want someone who has a good understanding, right, of what the geopolitical dynamics are, not just China, but China with the rest of the world. Government and diplomatic experience. And, Susan and I are both on the board of TC Energy, as I mentioned earlier, former ambassadors, trade negotiators, intelligence officials, incredibly invaluable. We had David McNaughton, the Canadian ambassador to the US, on our board, and I have to say, phenomenal. Before that, Derek Burney, who was also a Canadian ambassador to the US, who worked with Ryan Mulroney. And these people bring superlative, big picture, having been, hands-on with respect to diplomatic engagement. So I think that's another one. Crisis management, the ability to respond to geopolitical shocks, for example, and multi-jurisdictional compliance, skills in aligning operations and with conflicting regulations. So fairly a big deal of complexity here. So I think it's really important for more and more boards to think about how they get that geopolitical experience. And my feeling is that a board level competence is required. Why? Because this trend is going to accelerate. We have now a multipolar world order, US-China rivalry, BRICS expansion, regional blocs, ASEAN, African Union, fragmented global governance. We have climate-driven conflicts, resource scarcity, energy transition, which will heighten disputes around critical minerals. And then tech is being used as a geopolitical tool, right? AI, semiconductors, quantum computing are all now battlegrounds for national power, requiring boards to manage tech-related political risks. So I think the geopolitical one would be the top of my list. AI, I think it depends very much on the company, right? So if you take, I'm on the board of Intact, we have a director who is a world leader, literally written some of the definitive textbooks and is traveling the world providing advice, because Intact Insurance is absolutely leading edge in terms of using AI and to price risk, for example, and do claims adjustment. So you could see on a company like Intact why we need someone who really understands AI on the board. Maybe less so in other companies. They can get that knowledge through having experts come and present to the board. Like in Magna, we had an expert present to the board. We've chosen in Magna to have geopolitical experts who have auto industry background. So, but let me conclude by saying that geopolitical savvy is no longer optional. I think they're essential for risk mitigation and for strategic agility.
Thanks, Indira. I've been doing this for a while, and it's always curious to see how the demands on boards evolves and changes or increases. And I must say, I think your jobs are harder than they used to be. And I think you're reflecting that in your comments about the geopolitical savvy. We do have a question, a poll on composition needs of boards. So let's bring that up and have the audience click their way through that. And so we'll get that information and that results in a couple of minutes. Susan, over to you. Let's focus a little bit on the executive level, and then we'll have to do the question on the executives as well at the end of that. So really here, we're wondering about how are boards thinking through the success profile for the CEO and executives, and how is it changing and what's becoming more critical? So over to you.
Will do. Thanks, Scott. So one thing before I answer that question, I just wanted to kind of have a segue from Indira's comments, because boards really need to think about their own diversity around the table. But as importantly, my view is there needs to be that critical, strong, trusted relationship with the CEO and executive team. And that's why it's a segue, because to have, as Indira mentioned, we had David McNaughton on the TC Energy board. The amount that, our CEO and executive team could go to him to provide and ask for his perspective, provide thoughts on what he needs, whether it's a technology expert, an ESG expert. I mean, that trusted relationship is so critical to be able to leverage the diversity that is around the board table in a much deeper way when needed. So, I just make that comment there. In terms of the executive team, really, I would say that, and Scott, you mentioned it, these jobs are getting tougher, right? I think from the time I left executive life to now, it feels like, the CEO of the future is this unicorn that everybody wants. I mean, they have to be everything to everybody. But, so I would say it's really just reinforce the importance of skills that are needed. And I would start with the number one is a great communicator, because if you think about managing through uncertain times, I mean, it's all about you control what you can control and you navigate through the uncertainty and you communicate out to your employees, to your shareholders, to the regulators, to your customers, to your suppliers. That level of communication in times of uncertainty to calm the waters is really, really critical. I also think that, that everything we've talked about, being nimble, adapt to change, all of that, solution oriented. And one of the key attributes of CEOs that I've seen with great CEOs are they're curious. They're curious. They're looking for solutions. They're open to new ways of work, new ways of partnership that will ensure that the opportunities out of disruptions are really highlighted for the company. So having a CEO and executive team that are really curious, that are great listeners, that are great communicators is important. But I also would say executives and CEOs that really are grounded in the fundamentals of their businesses and can walk through all that noise. So these are more broader CEOs of the future, I realize, but I think that helps you through any environment, right? Whether it's back to where we were in COVID and the world shut down, whether it is, I totally agree with Indira. She put it well when she said the genie is not going back in the bottle. The US as the, the currency of stability, the region of stability is no longer. And what we're talking about today is really long-term diversification, long-term decisions that are being taken to ensure that you don't get caught in a difficult situation in the future. So Those are, some thoughts that I have on executive teams and CEOs.
Thanks, and great intel from both of you. Let's see what the audience is thinking in terms of the board composition. So we asked the question about, given the recent policy shifts, is this causing your board to reassess composition needs? And the most prevalent answer this time is no, current composition remains appropriate at this time. The second one is under review, with a couple of folks saying that they've already identified some changes or it's not applicable at this time. So we'll see how that evolves maybe over the next year or two as things unfold, but that's the answer for today. Let's shift to the next question on executives and bring up the question there in terms of success factors. So I'll ask the audience to quickly go through this one.
Were you going to dive into the incentive plan?
Oh, we are. Pardon me. That's right. So on this one, if we shift gears a little bit, we're going to think about incentive design and the questions around, crunchy topics related to, how boards are navigating a complex environment and how they're going to make thoughtful decisions that balance the accountability to their shareholders and the fairness to their management teams. So folks listening in will know that there's traditional goal setting for incentive plans that's under pressure. There's economic outlooks that are shifting regularly, quarter to quarter, sometimes week to week, depending upon the market that you're selling to or getting product from. Organizations are having to anticipate more volatility in business outcomes, and boards may expect an increased need in terms of the use of discretion or some degree of judgment around how you set goals or adjudicate performance. So maybe I'll provide a little bit of context. So for clients that I see in the resource and commodity sensitive areas, we're generally seeing folks holding on to their budgets. However, they're very mindful of these macro factors and some of the implications on how a broader assessment of performance may be occurring, including, in some cases, especially here in Calgary, some M&A opportunities that have come up. So before I pass it to Bridget, maybe we could take up the last poll and then I'll pass it over to you. So in terms of, are folks changing their board's executive talent discussions? We're seeing some expansion of the succession depth, some building of organizational resilience, a certain number of folks saying not much change. And then the last or next most prevalent answer is some strengthening of business fundamentals. So it kind of gives us an idea of how boards are thinking about their executive teams. And with that, Bridget, I'll pass it over to you because I know you've got some clients who've been more proactive and how they're thinking about their incentives.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I do have a number of clients that have been, I'd say, re-examining the resilience of their incentive programs in addition to the scorecards, that many of which were just approved a few months ago. And so as we've been working with clients here, as they are preparing, our counsel is that as you're preparing for your Q2 meetings, so we're talking about calendar year end organizations, we'd suggest this is an opportune time to establish a dialogue between the board and management on the state of compensation plans, well in advance of the year end. In terms of a framework that can help guide those discussions, we'd highlight the following as being important. So alignment on business facts, including, how is performance broadly, business performance tracking to plan? And do we, as the board and the management team, have a common understanding of the sensitivity of our business outcomes to various movements in various macro indicators like GDP growth, interest rates, unemployment, commodity prices, and then how do each of those translate into risks and opportunities for the business? As an interesting anecdote, picking up on Scott's earlier point, I have a client that did a lot of work on this topic, in the beginning of fiscal 25, a heavy exposure to the consumer discretionary sector. So concerns around what's going to happen if the tariffs come in full force and people stop spending. And so what they ended up doing was they agreed between management and the board that if GDP growth was tracking a certain degree below the forecasted level that was embedded in their business plan, then that would trigger a discussion at the board level on the short-term incentive targets between management and the HR committee. No agreement that anything would change, but just this would be a very clear trigger that we will have a conversation. So that was an interesting example of this, is kind of seeing this in action. Secondly, as you engage in these conversations, we think it's important to align on the compensation facts. So, how are in-flight business or comp plans tracking, both in terms of STIP and LTIP? What do we feel like if we project out for the full year based on what we know today? How are we feeling about how things will pay out? Are there meaningful retention concerns or other challenges? And then what does scenario testing show us in terms of a range of possible outcomes? That's really important information for the board to have, for management to be aware of, and for everyone to be aligned on. And then finally, it'll be important to consider, what is the organization's compensation philosophy with respect to extraordinary circumstances and events? How have you dealt with extraordinary events in the past? So during COVID, for example, and are there key learnings that can be leveraged from those times? So, in most cases, and most of our clients are taking the position, as Scott indicated, of, wait and see. Let's see how this year pans out. It's still pretty early, but given the current environment, to the extent you can lay groundwork for some of those year-end conversations early, it can make that year-end process smoother sailing, would be our advice to clients here. So interested, before we go back to Susan and Indira, I would love to hear their perspectives, but also want to hear from the audience how you are thinking about this topic internally, or sorry, at your organizations. So if we can pull up the final poll of today, and the questions around, to what degree are you in the process of revisiting your incentive programs, specifically the performance framework at the organization where you are either a board member or a senior executive? And we'll come back to that to see what folks are thinking about. But I'll turn it back to Susan, perhaps. I'm interested to hear what kind of conversations are happening at your boards on this topic, and how do you think about, ensuring the fidelity of your incentive plans in such a highly unpredictable environment?
Thanks, Bridget. So on both CN Rail and TC Energy, I mean, I would say we're more having discussions around, as Indira said, related to guidance. So, and grounding in the fact, excuse me, that you have the pay for performance philosophy, that the executive experience will be the shareholder experience. And so stepping back to say, where are we with what we put out for guidance? What are our assumptions? I do believe that, there are certain sectors, if you're in, as Indira mentioned, automotive or aluminum steel, would be very different than, say, TC Energy and pipeline. So you really need to step back and say, what have we given for guidance? What assumptions did we have? And back to the scenario planning, what can we do to still achieve that guidance with maybe other opportunities that are there now? And also recognizing that this starting and stopping, pausing, and I mean, as we look at the world today, the executive compensation may be very different as we go through year end, depending on what actually happens with tariffs. So there is a risk of doing it too early. And just to answer the poll on the boards I'm on, it's more too early to tell. We do know that our long-term incentive plans are designed to weather through a lot of different scenarios. So we look at them, make sure, that there isn't a major disconnect, and same with short term. But I would say it's really almost a too early to tell, and really grounding in what have we given for guidance? How are we treating our dividends? How are we treating our share buybacks? What are we doing for our own growth? And are there other opportunities that exist maybe today that didn't when we set our guidance? So, my experience is really in the too early to tell camp, but I do recognize that there are businesses that this would be critically important to look at if the world has turned upside down.
Yeah. Yeah, you're trying to strike that balance between pay for performance alignment with the shareholder experience, but also recognizing, employee retention and incentive is important, and people
For sure.
want to see some kind of path where there's possible achievement of some objectives that have been laid out, and how do you balance that at the board level? It's challenging.
Yeah, and Bridget, one thing you mentioned, COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there were a lot of lessons learned from COVID, and also probably a lot of trust that was built, at least in the organizations I'm at, where management knows that ultimately the board will do the right thing based on what ultimately happens. So there's a bit of trust and verify going on, but I would say that the dialogue with management is not about what's happening with us. It's more about how are we going to make sure we weather the storm that's in front of us.
Right, right. Indira, how has this shaped the conversations at your boards?
Well, much like Susan, too early to tell. Both Intact and Magna, very different industries,
Yes.
very different circumstances. But I think I think that if you have a good compensation framework, which I do believe we have in both companies, pay for performance, alignment with shareholder experience, I think is crucial. I think the business of retention is something that we will continue to worry about this year, given particularly in the automotive industry, some of the pressures. But I think your point, Bridget, earlier on, working with our independent consultant, which happens to be Hugessen for both my boards, so that makes it easier, is really monitoring every quarter. I have said, as chair of the HR committee, I want us to have that conversation every quarter. How are we tracking? What does it look like? And then so that, we don't wake up in November and have to sort of make some hard decisions, but we would be leading in a certain direction. And I think Susan's point around guidance, I think is a crucial one, right? We have to look at what have we said to the market about our business plan, and how confident are we that we can achieve it, I think is an important part of it. And finally, the comment that Susan made earlier, that enormous trust between management and the board is invaluable at a time like this, right? So that we maintain open communication, we understand the dynamics at play, and we support management through a very difficult time. This is one of the toughest times, if you will, after COVID, to be a CEO of a major company. So I think, I think that is going to factor in our thinking over the year.
Yeah. Yeah, the lessons from COVID are interesting because obviously different organizations were affected differently, depending on the sector and the nature of the business that you were in. But if we looked at just on LTIP, if we isolate on the LTIP piece, at May of 2020, we looked at what had happened to the markets and to the outstanding equity awards that had been granted. Everything was underwater. The bottom had fallen out of the market. By year end, by December, when things were vesting and the performance calculations were happening, the markets had come roaring back. And so it was a lesson in wait and see, and let's avoid making any kind of knee-jerk reaction, because if you had reloaded your executives at the bottom, there would have been a significant windfall. It's interesting to pick up some parallels. Maybe, who knows what will happen here in this situation, but we learned a lot.
Learn how context specific these implications can be on different companies, and that's very difficult to generalize what to do, and that you really have to look at each organization, who they're competing with, what talent looks like, what business operations look like, and what the future may bring. And it's quite unique, client to client in our experience. Bridget, back to you in the polls.
Sure. We have, I guess we should take up our last poll. And it sounds like for most folks, it's too early to tell, or no changes contemplated. So I guess it would be interesting to retake this poll in 6 months and see how people are feeling, as we head into year end for most organizations. Thanks, folks, for your participation in the polls today. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. Might pick up on some Q&A, and thank you for those that have submitted questions. Indira, there's a question here, picking up on your comment earlier around the need for political engagement and lobbying around some of these bigger policy questions and issues. What do you see as the board's role or individual directors' role in that kind of activity? Or is it more of in support of the CEO and the management team?
I think it's very much in support of the CEO and the management team. Depending on the company, you will have an individual reporting to the president, who has, significant responsibility for this. And in many cases, like in TC Energy, for example, including Magna, well-developed capacity in Washington, D.C., for example, and also in Ottawa. So, I think the board's role is to ask the questions around what the company is doing around any particular situation, and to understand how the company is engaging directly with politicians or through industry associations or however, not just to advocate for the sector, but also to develop intelligence on what may be, what may be happening, if you will, at government to government levels, as given how fast everything is changing. So
Yeah.
absolutely support the CEO, ask the questions, and be assured that that the right mechanisms are and the right channels are in place to
Right.
to ensure that the company is well informed and well positioned in a changing dynamic.
Thank you. Susan, there's a question around pan-Canadian harmonization, which we haven't really talked about today. So, the question's around, what do the panelists think about the utility of provincial harmonization of regulation and the expansion of interprovincial trade? What opportunities do you see existing there?
This is a great question. And I think, it goes back to my comments on, being able to think through the challenges, but also think about the opportunities that exist. So let's just think about, Ontario has announced, building projects in record time, right? Carney's come into power saying that he wants to break down barriers. He wants to work with the energy industry, ensuring that we have a good balance between, projects that are getting cleared and all the other, important factors we need to think about as it relates to ESG. So my personal perspective on this is there is a lot of low-hanging fruit in our country, a lot of low-hanging fruit. It is going to require a coordinated effort between business and government to ensure that this gets done. It cannot be headlining. It can't be something that is in people's mind right now. Initially there was discussion around, well, why didn't we build Energy East? Why didn't we build pipelines? Let's get at it. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be coordinated effort that begins now and continues long into the future to remind everybody why we're doing this. Because, Indira mentioned earlier this Coastal Gas Link with LNG Canada bringing, being able to diversify our own energy exports is important. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit and value between our own provinces that we have just got caught up in our own issues, right? And so it's really an awakening to say, hey, not only should you not have all eggs in one basket, whether it's the US or China or anywhere else, but you need to think about your own critical minerals, right? Is Trump going to come asking us for access to our critical minerals after Ukraine, right? We need to just wake up to our own value and help each other. So, but it is, I believe, to succeed will require business to be fully integrated with government.
Yeah. Thank you. And Indira, anything you'd add on that topic?
No, I think Susan said it well.
The one thing I just wouldn't mind commenting, Bridget, on the question you posed to Indira. Yes. I do think I agree the board should be there to support management for all of the political and regulatory efforts. But I do think as a board member, and of course Indira is well-versed politically, each and every board member needs to ensure they are, so that they're not slowing down management team, because so much is happening. And if you don't have that skill set on your board, that you bring in external parties to continually educate as the external world is evolving, because it's just happening so quickly. And if you have, we're going to mention David McNaughton how many times, but if you have the David McNaughtons on your board to give you context, it's so important. If you don't have it, to get it.
Absolutely.
I'd be curious to see how boards balance the need to have more of that capability around the boardroom table with the enduring need to have some traditional skill sets, industry knowledge, et cetera, right? And that trick shot will unfold over the next little while, but it'll be interesting to see how that works.
Mhm. I think we probably have time for maybe one more question. And there's a question here, which is admittedly a topic we really haven't touched on extensively today, but
Mhm.
how should boards of Canadian-based global companies be thinking about environmental sustainability issues and related expenditures in the context of, this massive rollback in the US of focus on this topic, while, other jurisdictions like the EU continue to have, and Canada continue to have more substantial sustainability requirements?
So
Either.
I can comment on that. First of all, I think that companies, certainly in my experience, and I think about Intact, which has been just remarkable in that, the whole ESG question has never been a separate strategy. It is integrated into the corporate strategy. Climate is a big concern if you're an insurance company and being the largest P&C insurer in Canada. And then the question of, diversity has now become kind of a loaded subject. But the fact of the matter is, if you have always wanted that your employees represent the communities in which you serve, you've always wanted to get the best talent, so therefore the most diverse pool. Those principles are very much integrated into the long-term strategy. I think that's the way you go forward, as opposed to having sort of responding to the flavor of the day, which I think is just a non-starter.
Right.
Yeah, and I would make a comment, when these strategies were set, there was dialogue around what makes sense for the business and what makes sense for our industry.
Right.
Right. And the whole notion of, greenwashing, and now it's like we're looking the other direction of, do we really believe it? Are we just changing based on the regulatory or political environment? It's really a time to pause and check. Does this really make sense? And it should, because to Indira's point, it should be integrated within the strategy. And so, my experience has been, we need to stick with what we believe is adding value to our business and to our sector, and not a regulation or, obviously if we have to comply with regulation, that's one thing, but a political will changes. So off you go and follow that. I think that's very dangerous.
Maybe with that, I'll bring our webinar to a close. Indira, Susan, thank you so much for joining Bridget and I today. Your comments have been wonderful, very rich, very detailed. I'm sure folks will look back on this and be grateful for the opportunity to watch the video and to have attended today. Appreciate the time that you took to get ready for today. Thank you to our participants. I think I saw at one point we had 200 or 250 people attending today, so a great turnout. I know there was 450 registered, so there'll be folks watching the recording in a couple of weeks. Thank you to the ICD for their support in marketing and organizing the event. And with that, I will call our webinar to conclusion for today. Thank you.